Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your conference and your meetings. I would really have liked to have been there to be with you in person. I really would like to have been able to visit your beautiful country and your city. However, conditions aren't very good about traveling right now, so we'll see how this virtual presentation goes. I would like to spend about an hour or so, maybe a little bit less, having you think about what do we mean by multi-tiered systems of support? What have we learned about it? How does this apply to positive behavioral interventions and supports? And what does it mean for our future and what we can do in education? And I have some thoughts about, how we might think about this in our present conditions. Um, so first of all, I would like to start out by acknowledging your wonderful country, your elders, your current people within your community and your neighborhoods, and what a wonderful opportunity this is for us to be able to chat with each other. I'd also like to acknowledge the children, youth, and adults and others with whom I've had the great privilege to be able to work from and with, and also to learn from as we think about implementing supports for our children and our families. I'd also like to thank all of you who are part of this call, this virtual conference, if you will. School personnel, researchers, trainers, graduate students, and so forth. In particular, I'd like to thank the Association for Positive Behavioral Supports and the network in Taiwan, who have set up this event, and all the wonderful people who have been working with me to make this presentation possible. And also the Department of Special Ed in the National Taiwan Normal University, as well as the Association for Positive Behavioral Support International for supporting this activity. Again, many people have been contributing to this particular event, and my ability to be able to present with you and to be with you is because of the great effort of these individuals. So here's what I'd like to be able to do. I'd like to be able to share some of the key features that make multi-tiered systems important and make it work for us. And also like to provide you with some guidelines for how we think about implementing proven evidence-based practices within the context of multi-tiered supports. Because I really believe that multi-tiered supports is not really an intervention for kids. It's about an organizational way of thinking how we support the adults who are implementing those practices. I'd like to do this in the context of where we're at in 2021 and where we've been in 2020 and before. Unlike any other time, we've experienced significant disruptions, harm, trauma related to a number of different factors. The most important, of course, is COVID-19 and all its variants that are out there, and also some of the social and political unrest that's out in our government as well as within our environment. I'd like to have you think about what we're going to be doing next as not a return to normal, because that return to normal is going to be inadequate. I'd like to argue that even though we have some great practices that have been proven, we have not done a good job with implementation, and that multi-tiered systems provide an opportunity to be able to do that better. I also have a disclaimer, and that is I've actually been retired for 2 years and 132 days. Not that I'm counting or anything, but that's an important contextual piece because I have not been part of the active implementation of multi-tiered systems. However, I'd like to share with you about 40 years of experience and how that has related to where we are today. But I also acknowledge that I'm not current on some of the most recent research, and that'll become incumbent upon you to kind of make sure that you take what I say and present to you today in that context. I'm hoping that there are two critical outcomes associated with this interaction that I'm having with you. One is I'm hoping that you're going to improve your working knowledge of multi-tiered systems and walk away with the idea that it's an organizational framework for all of us, and it's a way to improve our implementation of proven practices. The second thing I'm hoping that you'll walk away with is one or two things that you will actively do. It's really easy to talk about multi-tiered systems. It's harder to actually do something. And I'd like you to think about and focus on what we can do to improve the outcomes for our kids and our families, especially those students with high risk. As a context for this, I just want to put together for you a little bit of way of how we think about multi-tiered systems and the current situation we're in. I've kind of covered a little bit of this already in some of my introductory comments, so I'll cover this relatively quickly. But I'd like you to think about how important it is to be aware of where we've been, pre-2020 in particular. I would argue that we have some great implementation success. And you can see that in our research, you can see that in our schools, you can see that across many of our states and our countries that we've been implementing multi-tiered systems and PBIS in particular. And I'd like you to consider that we have quite a bit of knowledge about what we know can work. I also would like to argue that we have not done a good job of making sure that we have given equitable opportunities for all our families and all our students and all our schools to be successful. And in particular, those kids who might come into our schools with disability, inequities, with poverty, with neighborhood difficulties, and so forth. Kids with risk need a better experience than just what we've done in the past, and particularly under the current conditions. I'd like to argue that in some ways, we've actually created a widening gap between those kids who've been successful and those kids who have not, as well as access to those things that are best practice. And I'd like us to think about that as we move into 2021 and as well as into our future 2022 and beyond. I'd like to suggest to you that in 2020, we have had a year that's unlike any other year that we've ever experienced. COVID-19 in particular and all its variants have caused significant trauma, disruption, and harm. And we know that at the same time, we've had significant international political unrest. We've had increases in violence around the world. We've had situations where hate crimes have become much more salient and extremist kinds of behaviors have become much more prominent. And that's made it much more difficult for us to do our work in education. As a result of where we've been in the past and of what's happened in 2020, I'd argue that getting access to best practice has been much more difficult, and we've increased the gap between those individuals who have access and those who do not. In 2021, which is currently where we're at now, I think we've actually found ways to improve how we can provide supports. We know that vaccinations are important. We know that masking is important. We know that having the ability to support our kids and families becomes an important part of doing this work. We've increased our awareness of environmental and climatic crises. We've increased our awareness of political bipartisanship and antisocial violence and racism. And that awareness has increased our ability to think about what we need to do next. And I'd argue that our focus on returning to normal is not going to be a good focus. What we really have to focus on is being able to do something better than what we've done in the past and creating a normal that's more efficient. And on the right-hand side here, I've got a number of considerations, and this is where I hope to conclude. And my concluding comments, just to give you sort of a heads up on this, is that we really want to think about creating a better normal, something better than what we've done in the past. And I'd argue that one of our biggest focus has to be on equity. But kids with disabilities, kids with high risk, kids with behavioral and mental health issues are not getting a fair access to what they need to have. And that we're going to need to improve our ability to improve the environment in order for people to get access to what they need to have, kids in particular. So it's an opportunity problem. It's an access problem. And I think multi-tiered systems are going to provide us with a way to increase access and increase opportunities as we think about this better normal. I think we already have a good toolbox of evidence-based defendable practices. What I think about is that we're going to have to improve our systems, which is what this presentation is going to be about, by which we provide good leadership in creating the change that's required. So I'd like us to start by thinking about, and I'm going to kind of give you a quote from Trevor Noah, who's a TV person in the United States. You may have known something about him. And he has focused on the hate problem within the United States, and particularly the issues around racial disparities and the mass killings that have occurred. But I'd like to argue that many of his points apply to the wider problem that we're trying to address around education, around disability, around providing evidence-based practices. And one of his recommendations is that we have to find a way to organize and join organizations and become more unified in our effort to try to improve our supports to kids with disabilities. He also suggests that we need to reach out. We can't just do this alone within education. We're going to have to include public health. We're going to have to include mental health. We're going to have to include the medical community. We can't do this alone. He also suggests that we as individuals need to invest in donating our time and money because we need to do whatever we can. We can't just sit back and do nothing. We have to try to do something. And I'm going to argue that one of the things that we can do in education is to pick the smallest thing that has the biggest effect. And more importantly, he says we really have to try to improve our attention so it does not happen again, meaning that we don't fall back, that we have a system in place that allows us to respond to future problems, but also allows us to be able to support kids now in better ways. Okay, I want to spend a few minutes, just a few, focusing on what I consider basics. And some of this you may have heard already, but I want to suggest to you that what we know about multi-tiered systems has not gone as well as it could because we've not focused on doing the basics well. So I apologize if this is redundant with what you already know and do, but I want to repeat these things because they're so important for us to pay attention to as we move forward. Also, it's so important for you to stress in your future work. So here's what I'd like you to think about. And I'll do this sort of the fast way. And this is my way of thinking about change. How do we create change in more complex systems like schools, in our public and mental health systems? I think words are really important. And I'm giving you words right now to think about because they provide us with a focus and they provide us with a way to communicate. However, words are insufficient for creating change. Change occurs when we translate those words into actions. And those actions are things that have a direct effect on the kids and families with whom we work. I also want you to remember that those words, those actions really don't mean a whole lot until we as individuals change what we do. And we need to change what we do in ways that are relevant to the key audiences and the key stakeholders within our systems, meaning kids and families. So each of us as individuals have a responsibility to change our actions, change our behaviors in ways that are directly relevant to the kids and families with whom we work. If kids and families can't feel, experience our individual actions, then it's not relevant to their experience. We can't expect change to occur. When change occurs at the individual level and change occurs across individuals in a consistent way, then we empower our groups and individuals to create change. We know that we have a successful group when we have a common vision, a common set of words, and a common set of actions. We know where we're going, we have a way to communicate, and we have a common set of acts that we engage in or behaviors. Empowerment occurs when we have common vision, common language, common actions. So to backtrack, words are important, but you got to translate those to actions. For actions to work, the individual has to invest in change. When a bunch of individuals come together as a group with a common vision, a common words, and common language, common actions, we are empowered to be able to produce change for the individuals from whom we're most concerned about. Who benefits from those acts? Those are going to be the kids and families. And those benefits are going to be maximized when we use acts or actions that are linked to evidence-based practices. Those evidence-based practices are those for which that are defendable. And those defendable actions, when implemented by a group, can have the greatest benefits. And when we have those group-based benefits, we have a greater chance of creating environments or organizations like schools that are going to be just, inclusive, and equitable. So that's a lot of words, but what that means is we got to work as teams. You can't work as individuals. You can't walk away from this conference, this meeting, without having the knowledge that can work together as groups. Okay, so what are multi-tiered systems? And PBIS, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, which is where I come from, is an example of multi-tiered systems. There are many examples of multi-tiered systems. You can search on that in the web and you'll come up with lots of different examples. But what's most important for me is that you understand that MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems and Supports, is really an implementation or decision-making framework. It's not an intervention for kids. It's a framework that allows us to make better decisions as the adults who support kids. Now, that framework is based on the public health model of prevention. And it's based on a continuum logic, a three-tiered logic of support that says, what can we do to prevent problem behaviors from occurring and prevent problem behaviors from developing? The framework, the decision-making framework, is based on a prevention logic. And I'll kind of elaborate on that in a second. So to backtrack, it's a framework. It's a decision-making framework, not for kids, it's for the adults. It's a framework that focuses on prevention. It allows us to take defendable, culturally relevant teaching and learning experiences so that kids can benefit, so they can have access to equitable opportunities and academic success. So if somebody says to you, what is MTSS? You need to say it's a framework for helping us make better decisions. It's based on a public health logic, prevention logic in particular, and it allows us to select evidence-based practices and improve the experiences that kids and families have in their teaching and learning inside of schools. All right, so what is this continuum that I mentioned before, and how does it relate to prevention? This has been around since many years, from the 60s, 1960s. It really focuses on how do we think about the public health model and how do we use it within our schools? How do we use it within our work within schools? My work, your work, has always been about prevention. What can we do to help kids who are already having some difficulties and prevent them from having more challenges? And how do we prevent problems from occurring? The main message here is that it's built around prevention, and Tier 1, which is the primary prevention logic, is for everybody. It includes all students, all adults, across all environments. Tiers 2 and 3, which is the more specialized work we do with groups and individuals, cannot be as effective and efficient and relevant if we don't have Tier 1 in place. So you might work with individuals with significant issues. Your focus, though, has to be on how do we make sure that the larger environment, the classroom, the school, is one that is positive, preventative, nourishing, and teaching. Because without a nourishing school-wide, classroom-wide environment, it's difficult to do our individual student work. Very important to remember that Tier 1 is the basis for which Tier 2 and Tier 3 can be successful. And all three are part of the continuum that make up multi-tiered systems of support. So main message, strong Tier 1 is needed for Tier 2 and Tier 3 to work, but it requires all students, all adults across all settings. Asian languages. So what's important then is that I need Tier 3 supports for Patois or Taiwanese or Mandarin or what have you. What happens then is that I also have some areas that I need some assistance with. I know a little bit about statistics, but I need somebody to help me with them. I need some Tier 2 supports. And down at the bottom, you'll see some areas that I do not need any help at all. I'm pretty good about cooking. I'm pretty good about playing billiards. I'm pretty good about riding my bicycle. So I have a continuum of supports. My wife says I need supports in expressing my emotions. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't make me a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 husband. What it says is that I need some Tier 2 supports for that particular area. I have a continuum of supports that I need. Some areas that I do not need assistance and other areas that I do. Each of you that are on this call most of you on this call understand that you also have a continuum of supports, right, that you require to be a successful adult in work, at home, or in the community. So if you put all of that together, what you find is that the continuum is a little bit more complicated. All individuals experience Tier 1. In this example, all kids learn about respect, responsibility, and safety within their school. Some of the kids get group-based support or counseling or assistance for cooperative play, self-management, or what have you. And then you'll notice all those little peaks at the very top. Those are individual students. And those students receive individual assistance for some areas for which they're having difficulties. Now, the kid who's receiving supports for bullying also might be part of the group and receiving cooperative play assistance, or Tier 2. But he's also learning about respect, responsibility, and safety across the whole school, across the whole classroom. So, all individuals within a school receive Tier 1. Some kids receive Tier 2 and Tier 1 support, Tier 3 support, and some kids experience stuff across everything across the continuum. But everybody will get Tier 1. Tier 1 is the base by which we do our work. Very important message for you to remember. So one more piece about the review here, and that is for us to remember that my world is about behavior, but it's also important to understand that it can also address areas around academic and behavioral systems. It could be around reading, it could be around math, it can be around calculus, it could be around physics. All kids will receive some instruction in the classroom for the general curriculum for math. Some kids will need some extra tutoring in a small group, and some kids will need some specialized assistance to learn about calculus. A continuum of supports needs to be put in place for the kids to be successful, academically and behaviorally. So MTSS is an integrated system across all areas. My area of interest has always been on the behavioral side, but I know that the behavioral supports are integrated with the academic, because if kids aren't engaged, they can't benefit from the academic side. If kids aren't successful academically, then they express themselves through their social behavior challenges. All right, so one thing you have is a homework assignment. And this homework assignment is for you to look at yourself and identify what are the areas for which you need assistance and those areas for which you're quite good at. And I'm focusing on your professional skills. Some of you do really well with kids who have temper tantrums. Some of you need assistance with kids who have temper tantrums. Some of you have your own temper tantrums. And so where do you fit on this continuum of strengths and needs? And what kinds of supports do you need to rely upon within your school or in your classroom in order to be successful? I also challenge you as a homework assignment to pick a few of your children and put them into this triangle and say to yourselves, what are their strengths and what are their needs? Because when you do this, what happens then is you understand that kids have a continuum of supports and they're not one-dimensional. I also ask you to have some of your students fill this out on themselves so they self-assess how they fit into this particular continuum. Okay, so let me move forward. I notice my video is now working again, so hopefully this is not too distracting to you. But what's most important, of course, is what I'm kind of presenting or communicating to you, as well as what's in those slides. So in the last 30, 25 minutes or so, what I'm going to like to do is shift a little bit and have you think about where we're headed for the future and a little bit of a review as we get there. So remember, this is just a reminder for where we've been. MTSS is a logic. It's based on a prevention model. It allows us to guide the adults in their decision making. It allows all of us, teachers, psychologists, administrators, etc., to figure out what they need to do for all kids. Tier 1 is for everyone. Remember, we don't label people, we label their practice. That is a Tier 3 intervention. That is a Tier 3 problem, but we don't label kids. George is not a Tier 3 person. Students with disabilities have strengths, needs, and they have a range of supports, just like all individuals. It's just that some of their needs are greater. Some of their supports are greater. And what's also important is context. Where you do this is a big deal. MTS can be applied in alternative schools, can be applied in public schools, can be provided in private schools. It's a way for us just to organize what we do. It's a way to organize what we do at the university. It's a way to organize what we do in institutions and as well as in some of our other organizations within our support systems. Okay, so if I had a tattoo, and I don't have tattoos, but if I had one, this might be one of them because it's such an important part for how do we make the continuum work? How do we make MTSS work? It's so easy to focus on the interventions. What do we do with students? And that's that bottom circle, practices. But what's most important, though, is that we understand that practices are part of 4 essential elements. Practices are those things that we pick that are aligned with or culturally relevant to the individuals with whom we're working. The practices need to be those that are defendable, but those defendable practices have to be linked to the outcomes we're trying to achieve. The practice has to be linked to what we're trying to achieve with the student. The practice has to be linked to the adults with whom we're trying to provide them with the skill to achieve a certain kind of outcome. The data are used to guide us in our selection of practices. The data are used to guide us in being able to narrow down the outcome that we're trying to achieve. The systems are used to help the adults use the practice, for the adults to make good decisions with the data, for the adults to know whether or not the outcomes are being achieved. You got to have all 4 in order to set up a multi-tiered system or organization. All of them have to be linked, modified, adapted to your given culture. I am pretty confident that this logic of 4 elements can work in Taiwan, but you have to make it culturally and contextually relevant to your language, to your culture, to your classrooms and schools, because they are different in compared to the United States. They're different compared to Australia. They're different compared to Bosnia. But the 4 elements are always going to be present. What do the adults need to have? What decisions do we need to make for the data? Where are we trying to go? The outcomes. And lastly, what are the interventions we're going to select to make sure that we organize all those together? If you were to ask me to work with your implementation teams, I would not just come to you and say, here's what you need to do. What I would ask you to do is, how are you organized to do this well? How do we make sure that you have the data to guide us? And what do we need to, how do you know, and where do we need to go to get there? And lastly, what are the defendable practices you're going to use that I know are aligned with those outcomes? MTSS logic gives us focus on what the adults do. Because if the adults got their act together, especially as a group, as an organization, then kids will benefit. Again, just a different way to represent the same thing. Now, if you think about those 4 elements, outcomes, data, practices, and systems, you can think about them within the context of a continuum. As you go up the triangle, our attention, our emphasis, our specialization for outcomes, data, and practice and systems increases. You have a little bit more room at the bottom for tier 1. You don't have to focus as much on the practices data because the kids are more responsive at that level. But there are some kids who need more. And when more means you got to give more attention to the data, more attention to, or specificity to the outcome, more attention to a specialized intervention, and then more attention to how the adults are going to deliver that. Okay? So the outcomes, data, practice, and systems are the tools in your toolbox to make the continuum work well. Okay. Now, to finish off, I want to focus on some considerations, and then I'll conclude with a couple summary statements, and then I will close out and have you think about what acts you're going to engage in. Again, my words are just ways to prompt action. Multi-tiered systems, some considerations. First of all, I want you to understand that MTSS and the way I'm kind of presenting it to you is really based on a behavioral science. And that behavioral sciences is the theoretical conceptual framework for what we work with. One good summary of that behavioral science is a book that Tony Biglin has done, 2015, about 6 years ago or so. It's called the nurture effect. He's done a wonderful job of organizing what do we mean by prevention and what do we mean by the behavioral sciences. And I'm going to summarize some of that as we move forward. Okay, so I want us to remember that defendable evidence-based practices requires three important considerations. It's not just going to the store and buying something because it's new and shiny. Picking an evidence-based practice and implementing it so that it has a big effect requires an attention to three aspects. And I'm going to quickly go through these, and I'll let you kind of play with them a little bit later. But you got to start by knowing what the problem is that you're trying to address. And what that means is, can the kid do now? Where do we want the kid to be next? And what is the environment in which we're asking the kid to do something or the student to do something better? You got to know where you're going to implement the practice and what the kid can do, what the kid can't do, and the context in which it's being applied. Is this the classroom? Is this the hallway? Is this at home? Is this in the small group center over on the other side of the school? Where are we talking about? What can the kid do now? What do we need the student to be able to do next? Got to be clear about that. The second aspect is you got to pick an intervention which you have high confidence will produce the outcome that you want. And I say that on purpose. It's got to align to the outcome. We sometimes pick evidence-based practices, and yeah, they're evidence-based, but they don't produce the same outcome for which we're trying to achieve. It's great, it's defendable, but is it what we need to have? So it's got to be aligned. That also means, is it something that fits our particular environment? Was it actually tested in an environment that's similar to where we're going to be using it? It might have been tested in the United States to be proven to be effective, but now the question is, can you implement it within a classroom in Taiwan or in Japan or Korea or wherever you might be? Because if it's not aligned to the context, if it's not aligned to the setting in which it's being applied, so that it can maximize the outcome that you're trying to achieve and be implemented with high fidelity, we're going to have some difficulty. So relevance becomes a big deal. Is it relevant to the students with whom you're trying to apply it? It might have been done with kids who might have significant developmental disabilities and proven to be effective. The question is, can it be done with kids with some severe emotional disturbance? If you can show that it will, and you can make the adaptations that'll make that happen, then go for it. So you got to know where it's going to be applied with whom. We got to make sure that you have high confidence in the evidence base that's being used to justify the intervention. And the last one is you got to make sure that you're keeping track of the implementation. And what I mean by that is we're implementing it with high fidelity or accuracy. Some people invest in an evidence-based practice, but they implement it poorly. And they don't implement it the way that the directions are being set up. They don't implement it with the way that maximizes the likelihood that kids will benefit from it. So you got to make sure that it's being implemented with the highest degree of accuracy. Second of all, you got to make sure that you're tracking the kid's response to that intervention. Some people implement something really well, but they don't keep track of whether or not the students are actually improving or not. You have to have a measurement system or a way of tracking how well the kids are responding. Are they responding slowly? Are they responding very quickly so we can shorten the intervention time? Are they implementing not at all, so we need to change the intervention or modify the intervention? And the last one is, have we made enough changes so it's contextually relevant? Have we changed the language? Have we changed the experiences so the examples are relevant to the learner? Those changes are going to be made in the context of implementation fidelity and student responsiveness. So it's so important to kind of think about those three things together. So to summarize, you got to know something about the kid and what he or she's doing. You got to know about the place. You got to make sure you know that the intervention is one that has a high likelihood of working. And lastly, you got to keep track of what's going on. So the main messages here is, are you willing to bet your next month's salary on the decision that you just made? If you're not willing to bet your next month's salary, then we need to go back and make sure our selections are better. Are you willing to say that this implementation, right, is being implemented with the greatest degree of fidelity and with the greatest degree of fit. If you're not willing to say those two things, then you want to step back and don't implement it, because the kid will not benefit or the kid might be harmed by that particular intervention. Okay, so here's an example. Right now, we are focused very much on trauma-informed interventions and supports. What we're concerned about is that what the kids and families and our teachers and our administrators are experiencing right now. In the United States, which I'd argue is occurring across many different countries, is our students, our children, our teenagers, our youth, our families are experiencing significant trauma, more so than they've ever experienced before. And the proportion of kids who are having difficulties, mental health issues, as well as learning difficulties is much greater than we've experienced. And what we find is that kids are going to be coming to school carrying that baggage, and we need to be ready. And we need to be ready at the level of being able to know who needs assistance when they walk in that schoolhouse door, in that classroom. We have a great evidence base that tells us what we can do. And here's a summary of some of those interventions on the right hand of this picture. One of my favorite places is the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they have this great curriculum called the Tolerance Curriculum, or the Tolerance Project. And that Tolerance Project includes supports we can give kids around trauma. So what do we do with kids who have had difficulty at home because a parent has been significantly affected by COVID, or they may even have experienced a death within the family? What kinds of supports do we need to put in place for the classroom teachers who have experienced significant trauma within their own lives? They've had a partner or a family member who has died or has been in intensive care. They may have had a colleague or a neighbor who has asked them for assistance. They may have had, their own difficulties within. We know that COVID has had a significant effect on our kids and families. And that's true of other things as well. And those are things like some of the increase in violence that we've experienced in the United States, some of the race conflicts that have occurred, some of the political unrest that's occurred. Our kids and families are going to be carrying that to school. So what do we need to make sure we do? We don't want to get tough with those kids. We don't want to punish them because of their trauma and the way they're experiencing it. What you want to think about is how can we create environments that are more welcoming and caring and more supportive. And what that means is the multi-tiered system support becomes a structure or an organizational model for us to do that well. So for example, on this list on the right-hand side, the recommendations are you need to establish our routines so kids know what's expected of them and adults know what to provide. We need to actively engage with our kids, because without active engagement, you can't build relationships. We need to create environments that are safe so that kids feel like they can engage, share, communicate, talk with us, and ask for assistance. We need to create experiences that are available to everyone. Everyone needs to know what the routines are. Everyone needs to be engaged. Everyone needs to know that they have a sense that they're in environments that are safe. Some kids are going to need a little more engagement. Some kids are going to need a little bit more teaching of the routines. Some kids are going to need a little bit more practice with what it means to be safe. And we move up the tiered system. And that's why the tiered system gives us that ability to individualize across the continuum. We know some families are going to send their kids to school and they're going to be fine with a little bit of assistance when they know the routines of school. Some families are going to need a little bit extra assistance. We might need to call them or give them some materials. And some families are going to need some direct assistance. We know that if we catch kids from a preventative perspective early, if we catch families and support them early, we have a chance. Under the engagement item, I would also suggest to you that some kids need to be engaged before they come to school. We might need to call them. We might need to engage the family before the kids come in, because without that, we're going to have trouble with those kids when they come in. They need to know who they are and what the routines are, who we are when they walk into the school. The idea is not to say, okay, come on to school, kids, let's see what happens. That's too late. What we've learned is you got to catch the kids early and say, we know some of you have had some difficult experiences, and we want to make sure that all of you have some supports in place. And so that's just an example of how we want to think about trauma-informed interventions as evidence-based, but how do we think about the implementation of those across our organization within a tiered system? Okay, a couple other resources to you, and this is just sort of something that I'm very familiar with, and there are many other resources out there as well. The pbis.org site, which is available to you, it's easy to get to it on the internet. If you click around there, you'll find lots of supports there about how to address some of the issues that kids are walking in with the school in 2021 and beyond. Issues around any kind of trauma, but in particular around COVID, in particular around school violence or neighborhood violence, as well as around issues around mental health issues as well. And there's some examples that are represented on this picture. But I'd encourage you to take a look at those, because what they do is they take what we've learned in the past, they help us say these are important for right now, and how can we apply those in the future? Because in the future, we know that kids are going to come in with some pretty significant issues. All right, so this is why the MTS model is so important. Traditionally, what we tend to do is we wait and see what happens. And when a crisis occurs, like COVID, like a death within a family, like, we have this emotional response, and then we tend to be reactive, and we try to punish or to become more severe to try to suppress the problem. And then we put in place policies that reflect that reactive management. For example, in the United States, we had an increase, and we're expecting an increase in bullying right now in the United States, because we're going to have kids who are going to be teased because they wear a mask. We're going to have kids who are going to be teased because they're afraid of COVID. We're going to have kids who are teased because they try to stay 6 feet apart. What happens then is we put in place verbal threats. We threaten kids, don't do that anymore. Leave him or her alone. If you continue to do that, we're going to send you home. If you don't follow through those directions, we're going to send you home, and we're going to suspend you for 4 days. And then we put in policies that tell kids and parents, we're going to exclude kids. We're going to exclude you from schools because of the bullying behaviors you're engaged in, as an example. That is a typical response. In the United States right now, that's occurring because we know that kids are going to come to school around issues, around racial issues, around immigration, around COVID, and so forth. I know as an Asian American in the United States, we have some individuals who are bullying and harassing Asian Americans because we are associated with what people thought was the cause of COVID in the United States. And so we are sometimes experiencing harassment. And we know that escalating consequences is not going to be a good way to solve it. So we're suggesting to you is that there's got to be a different way. And that different way, frankly, is the prevention model that is presented through the MTSS logic. I would suggest to you is that you stay away from reactive decision-making, getting tough. A getting tough response is going to make matters worse, or it's going to exclude kids. It's going to cause kids to be segregated away. And that's not a good solution, because what it does is it doesn't solve the problem, it just puts it someplace else. I would encourage you to invest in team-based decision-making. Get the group together and implement an MTSS logic so that you have good leadership and good participation, because without that, we're going to struggle. All right, so moving forward again. Here's a summary of what I just kind of described for you. And the main message, of course, is you got to invest in Tier 1, because Tier 1 is for everyone, and that Tier 1 investment has to be focusing on prevention. That's that right-hand side or the green column. Double down, double up on prevention. Focus on the behavioral sciences, build that continuum of empirically based prevention practices, work as a team, use your information for decision-making, those 4 elements again, measure what's important to kids, and focus on the implementation supports the adults need to have to implement with fidelity. Remember, Tier 1 is the foundation for Tier 2 and Tier 3. Tier 2 and Tier 3 are easier to implement for the adults if Tier 1 is in place. Kids are going to experience better benefits at Tier 2 and Tier 3 if tier 1 is in place. This is all about avoiding reactive management, because reactive management ends up with all these negative outcomes, labeling people, excluding people, and so forth. So I encourage you to focus on prevention as a way to moving forward. Okay, in the last 10 minutes then, what I'd like to do is summarize and give you some examples of some practices. And these practices are interventions that I think we've learned are the smallest thing you can do to have the biggest effect. And what that means is that I don't want us to do more in trying to solve a problem. What I want us to do is pick the smallest thing that is doable, that can have the effect that we want. Because it's so important to make sure that kids experience these evidence-based practices. Because if they're not being implemented with high fidelity, the kids aren't going to be experiencing them. So I want us to invest in the smallest intervention, the smallest degree of change that has the highest probability of doing something that will work, right? I want us to make sure that you're using the best evidence-based practice that fits your situation that can have the biggest effect. Now, for example, and this is an example, internationally, what we've learned is that good classroom management produces positive, safe, caring classrooms if you do the following things. 1, you got to acknowledge kids when they do the right thing. That isn't to say you don't give corrections, but it does say you got to give kids the attention for doing the right thing. And that's verbal, it can be physical, it can be, through whatever mechanism that you find. But kids need to know that they're doing the right thing. And that means we've got to actively engage kids. Second thing, you got to have eyes wide open. You got to keep your eyes open to know which kids are doing well and which kids are struggling. Active supervision may be one of the more powerful things we can do to make sure we reinforce effectively. Pre-correction is the strategy my friend Jeff Colvin has come up with that says catch kids before they make the mistake. Most of us know which kids are having difficulties, and those kids that are having difficulties, we probably know when it's going to occur. So what we want to do is do something different before the kid engages in a problem behavior, as opposed to waiting for the kid to make the mistake. I want the kid to practice the right way before they make the mistake with the wrong way. All right, we do that all the time on the reading side. We had kids we teach them and practice the right words for a given when they're reading, so that when they see it in a paragraph, they can say it the right way. Pre-corrections are equally as important for social behavior as they are for the academic side. Academic success is one of our best prevention tools. When kids are experiencing academic success, they feel better about themselves, they're more likely to engage, they're more likely to learn social skills and so forth. And the last one is you got to teach social skills like we teach academic skills. Kids are not born respectful. Kids have to learn what respectful behavior looks like across different environments, because it does look different across different settings. If I was to have a classroom tomorrow and come out of retirement, I want to make sure that I would do at least these 5 things really well, because I know these are the 5 smallest things I can do in the classroom to have the biggest effect. If I was to go back to University of Connecticut and teach classroom management to new teachers, I want to make sure that they know these 5 things really well and can do them. If I was to go back to UConn, University of Connecticut, and teach school psychologists and school counselors how to work with the adults, I'd want to make sure that the school counselors teach the adults inside their schools to do these things really well. These are the ones to invest your money in. These are the ones that are worth their weight in gold. All right, to give you another example, a colleague of mine, Clayton Cook, who's at the University of Minnesota, and some others, Paul Caldera and others, have looked at positive greetings. And this person did a study looking at positive greetings at the door. What he learned was if you, a teacher, greets a kid at the door every day and says something nice to those kids, hello, good morning, good to see you, it decreases problem behavior when the kids enter the classroom, and it increases their academic engagement. A simple intervention at the door produces these significant Tier 1 outcomes. I say that on purpose, Tier 1 outcomes, because this is a tier 1 intervention. Some kids walking in the door might require an extra reminder. So when George walks in the door, we say, "Good morning, George, don't forget to hang up your backpack." That tier 1 support may be needed, but it's the same intervention. I've just increased it for George. But this is active supervision. This is positive engagement. This is positive reinforcement. Simple intervention, big effect. Easy to do, easy to implement. I've broken it down into its parts. Greet the kid at the door, give them a fist bump, say their name. "Good morning, George. Good to see you." Fist bump. Pre-correct activity. Don't forget to hang up your backpack. Nice job following directions. I like the way you walked in the classroom in a respectful way. Easy intervention. It can be applied as kids come in the lunchroom. It can be used when they walk in the schoolhouse door. It can be used when kids walk in at home. You can greet your kids at the door as they walk in from after school. It can be used when they walk in the school office. It can be used at sporting events when kids enter and provide their tickets. Positive greetings at the door increases the likelihood of kids behaving more appropriately when they get inside that door. Great intervention, great way to think about how to move this forward. Okay, so let me conclude here, and I want to conclude with just some general statements. I'll have you go back and look at the material on this slide on your own because it's just everything I've kind of emphasized. I'm going to focus on a couple things just because I think they're pretty important as you kind of process this content. And then I will close out. All right. So all of this is dependent upon thinking about MTSS as a continuum based on prevention logic. All of this is based on the idea that you got to implement all interventions across the tiers by paying attention to where you want to go, outcomes, using data to make your decisions, making sure that you use the best intervention money can buy, and lastly, that the adults have the supports to implement that continuum effectively. Those 4 elements, outcomes, data, practice, and systems, are going to be important for that continuum. However, the continuum is only going to be as good as the leadership that drives that implementation. Leadership meaning a leadership team that guides the implementation. Leadership means the principal or the school master or the school director, as well as at the national level, as well as at the local level. You got to have good leadership who understands what we're talking about here, or else those 4 elements in the continuum are not going to work very well. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that if you do these things well, you can produce positive, safe, responsible classroom and school climates for everyone. And it makes it so much easier to implement Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions for those kids who might need them for their particular areas. But this is all based on being able to implement with the greatest degree of fidelity and making it contextually and culturally relevant to the students and people and families and student and educators who work in those environments. Okay, so again, I'll have you look at those words. It's just a big idea summary of what I've covered so far. Okay, now, if I had to kind of conclude with some big ideas, here's what they look like. Again, MTSS is a way to organize the environment in which we teach and learn. We don't use MTSS to change people. We use this to change the interventions, to change the context. If the interventions are effective and the environments are effective, then we, the adults, and the kids, are likely to change. Here are the things that I love to communicate at the end of these kinds of presentations. You got to do a few things really well. Doing more is not the answer. Doing something more complicated that's not likely to be implemented is not something we recommend. You want to do a few things that are doable and make sure that you have a high confidence that they're going to work. High probability of working. What that means is you're willing to bet your next month's salary on the decision that you've made. All these interventions can be defendable, but you got to make sure that they are relevant to the places in which you're implementing them. I'm speaking to you from the United States. You got to take everything I'm saying to you and say to yourselves, how do we adapt it to the context of my particular Asian culture? Because we know they're different. You want to get away from the idea of wait and see. You want to focus on catching kids early. Catch them before they walk in the door. Catch them before they come to school. Catch them before they go into the cafeteria or lunchroom. Catch them before they walk into the sporting event. That's the way to go. We want to teach to learn, meaning that we want to teach social skills just like we teach academic skills. Remember, if you don't know what to do, err on the side of being positive, right? Don't be reactive and get tough. Focus on what you can do to support kids for doing things the right way. All right, so here's my requests. Here's your homework, so to speak. You have that one homework assignment already, all right? I want you to focus on systems. I don't want you to focus so much on the kids because kids will benefit if the systems are better implemented. Those systems are the organizations that have a common language, common vision, and common outcomes as well. And we know that we want to invest in education because education is one of those areas that can have the biggest effect on how kids develop. Focus on evidence-based practices, do a few things really well. You want to be an ally for your students, not just a teacher. You want to be there to support students in their success. And use the MTSS framework as a way to organize your decision-making, organize your practices, organize your systems. Your homework assignment is to check yourselves to make sure you're doing things in ways that are just, equitable, and fair. I want you to make sure that you yourself model what you want others to do. If we don't model what we ask kids to do, it's going to be hard for them to adopt and sustain what the practice and skills we teach them. I want to make sure you catch kids early, catch yourself early, so that you avoid those difficult situations. Teaching is the way to go, and make sure you actively engage. I want you to take those 5 items, and I want you to write a little plan for yourself and say, how am I going to do these things? How will I check myself? How will I model? How will I catch situations before I walk into them? How do I make sure I teach myself and others to do these things well? And how do I actively engage others? So I want to conclude there, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. I know that I can't see you and I can't respond to your questions, but the idea was to give you some content to think about multi-tiered systems and what you do in the areas for which you work. Happy to respond if you would like to email me at the email address on the slide at uconn.edu. I'm also encouraged to take a look at the materials available at ppis.org. Again, I thank you very, very much for inviting me. I'm hoping that in the future we'll have a chance to be able to see each other in person. And I'm hoping that you have a successful school year as you move forward. Again, I will make these materials available to you as well. I'll send them to the organizers, and I'm hoping that material will be helpful to you. Thank you again, and have a great 2021 and beyond.